Chapter 11, The Mansion in Tagaytay. The air on the ridge of Tagaytay was a different climate from the rest of the country. 60 kilometers south of the suffocating, humid smog of Manila, the elevation offered a perpetual, biting chill. The wind carried the scent of wet pine needles, rich mountain soil, and the faint, underlying trace of prehistoric sulfur from the ancient volcano resting in the center of the lake below. It was beautiful. It was pristine. Construction crews had worked around the clock for nearly a year, and as of 3 weeks ago, this colossal monument to immense wealth officially belonged to Marco Dizon. Mateo Reyes stood on the sprawling, cantilevered teakwood deck of the estate, looking out over the sheer drop. Far below, enveloped in the early evening mist, the dark, legendary waters of Taal Lake stretched out like an endless sheet of polished obsidian. In the center of the dark water rose the jagged, imposing crater of Taal volcano, smoking against the twilight sky. Behind Mateo, the mansion was a towering monument to unadulterated hubris. It was a 3-story fortress of imported glass, black steel, and poured concrete, secured behind 12-foot-high electrified gates and roaming patrols of private military contractors holding suppressed rifles. A year ago, Marco had purchased the land through 7 different shell companies, paying a staggering premium fully in cash to bulldoze a small farming community and violently erect his palace. It was the ultimate symbol of their newfound, undisputed success. But to Mateo, it also represented a dangerous shift in the fundamental rules of their partnership. When they had first met in the dirty alleyways of Tonda, Marco had been a cautious man. He preached the gospel of camouflage. He insisted on hiding behind dummy corporations and quiet laundry services. But power was a highly intoxicating drug, and Marco had developed a tolerance. He no longer wanted to hide. He wanted to be worshipped. Just 2 days prior, Mateo had strongly advised him to delay building the compound, warning that constructing a multi-hundred-million-peso fortress on the ridge would attract federal audits. Marco had practically laughed in his face. "You are still thinking like a frightened street dealer, Teo," Marco had sneered, openly pouring a drink. "I bought the senator who runs the audit committee. We don't hide from the government anymore. We own the government." The heavy sliding glass doors behind Mateo opened, letting out a sudden wave of classical music and the low, aristocratic hum of wealthy conversation. "You're brooding again, Teo," Marco said, stepping out onto the chilly deck holding 2 crystal flutes of champagne. He was wearing a white linen suit that billowed slightly in the mountain wind. "I spent 300 million pesos building the most spectacular view in the entire archipelago, and you're staring at the water like you expect it to bite you." Mateo didn't take the champagne. He kept his hands resting on the cold steel railing. "It's a lot of noise, Marco. The more noise you make, the more predators you attract." Marco laughed, taking a sip from his glass. "We are the apex predators, Mateo. When you slaughtered General Alves in that hotel room last month, and then burned Laotian's triads out of Binondo last week, you didn't just win a turf war. You proved we can fight on multiple fronts and crush an international syndicate without blinking. You terrified the entire underworld. No one is ever going to challenge our port operations again." Mateo looked back at the glass walls of the mansion. Inside, the living room looked like a scene from a royal court. Politicians, famous actors, high-ranking military officials, and untouchable socialites were drinking, laughing, and casually partaking in the premium, uncut cocaine laid out on silver platters by the waitstaff. The BGC nightclubs were where Marco collected blackmail. The Tagaytay mansion was where he threw extreme, Gatsby-esque parties to reward the people he had firmly under his thumb. It was an empire built on vice and fear, dressed up in silk and classical music. "They still have lieutenants," Mateo pointed out, his voice quiet over the wind. "General Alves is dead, but the southern syndicates aren't extinct. Hector Cruz is here tonight." Marco smiled, a dark, venomous expression spreading across his manicured face. "Yes. Hector El Toro Cruz. The man foolish enough to step up and claim Alves's empty throne. But watching us annihilate the Red Dragon Triad spooked him. He realized that if we can casually burn down Lao Shen's empire, we can easily eradicate what's left of his. He came here begging for a truce, bringing his two best bodyguards to ensure his safety. And you gave him your word, Mateo said, looking at Marco closely. I gave him a glass of scotch and a false sense of security, Marco corrected smoothly. He set his champagne down on an outdoor table. He reached into his linen jacket and pulled out a small, unmarked glass vial filled with a slightly viscous, clear liquid. Mateo recognized the vial. He had seen Marco's private chemist, a disgraced medical doctor who owed them millions in gambling debts, synthesizing it in the basement of the BGC clubs. I've been thinking about this ever since Lao Shen tried to poison our northern docks, Marco whispered, staring at the liquid with a sick fascination. Why just shoot a rival when you can make an example of his mind? My chemist spent a month extracting it. It aggressively attacks the voluntary nervous system but bypasses the autonomic functions. Your heart keeps beating and your diaphragm keeps pumping air. But every single muscle fiber under your direct control is severed. You lock up, trapped in a waking coma inside your own skin, horrifyingly aware. Mateo stared at the vial. He had killed dozens of men. He had shot them in alleys, strangled them on marble floors, and tortured an assassin in a basement. But there was always a brutal, necessary utility to his violence. It was about survival and maintaining the business. What Marco was holding wasn't about survival. It was a dark, psychological evolution. Marco wasn't just neutralizing threats anymore, he was starting to enjoy playing with his food. Mateo felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. This was exactly how mad kings behaved right before their empires collapsed. Bring Hector and his dogs down to the private wine cellar in 10 minutes, Marco ordered, pocketing the vial. Tell them I am ready to sign the official territory treaty. Marco stepped back into the warmth of the roaring party, leaving Mateo alone in the cold mountain air. The wine cellar was buried deep beneath the foundation of the mansion, carved directly into the cold bedrock of the ridge. It was lined with thousands of dusty, priceless bottles of vintage wine, illuminated by the flickering light of heavy iron sconces. Hector Cruz was a heavily tattooed man from Mindanao. He wore a loud, patterned silk shirt stretched tightly over his barrel chest. He sat nervously at the heavy oak tasting table, flanked by two towering, muscle-bound bodyguards whose hands never drifted far from the heavy pistols hidden under their jackets. Mateo stood silently in the corner of the cellar, leaning against a rack of French Bordeaux, his eyes tracking every micro-movement the southern gangsters made. Marco sat at the head of the table, smiling warmly. He poured dark, amber liquid from an antique crystal decanter into 4 heavy glasses. To a new era of mutually beneficial cooperation, Marco said, his voice echoing off the stone walls. The port of Manila remains ours. But the southern shipping routes through Cebu and Davao will remain untouched by my organization. You have my word as a gentleman, Hector. Hector stared at the glass, then lowered it back to the table. He wiped sweat from his thick forehead. You are a reasonable man, Marco. But I didn't survive the bloody politics in Mindanao by drinking from an open decanter poured by my enemy. I'll stick to bottled water, if it's all the same to you. Marco didn't look offended. He simply smiled, an empty expression that didn't reach his eyes. I understand, Hector. Trust is a rare commodity in our business. That's exactly why I preferred to buy yours. Hector's dark brows drew together in heavy confusion. What are you talking about? Click. Click. Hector froze. Behind him, his 2 trusted bodyguards had simultaneously drawn their heavy pistols, pressing the cold steel barrels firmly against the back of Hector's skull. Hector's eyes widened in sheer, paralyzing disbelief. He slowly raised his calloused hands in surrender. Marco's bottomless wealth had reached all the way down into the deepest pockets of Davao. Marco stood up slowly, seamlessly smoothing the pristine lapels of his white linen suit. He walked around the heavy oak table, pulling the small glass vial from his pocket. He uncorked it cleanly with his thumb. Hold his jaw open, Marco commanded gently. The bodyguard on the right grabbed Hector by the hair, jerking his head back while clamping a hand onto his jaw, forcing his mouth open. Hector fiercely thrashed, letting out a muffled, terrifying roar of pure fury, but with two loaded guns to his head and an arm locking his thick neck, he couldn't break free. Marco leaned in close, carelessly tipping the vial and pouring the viscous, clear liquid directly down Hector's throat. "Swallow, Toro," Marco whispered. Hector choked, gagging as the bitter liquid hit the back of his throat. He involuntarily swallowed. Marco immediately stepped back, giving a brief, dismissive nod to the bodyguards. Pft pft. Pft pft. Two suppressed shots from June, who had stepped silently out of the dark wine racks, took the treacherous bodyguards cleanly in the sides of their heads. They collapsed to the hard stone floor in a heavy heap. Hector didn't even have time to react to the gunshots before the neurotoxin hit him. The transition wasn't a clean, cinematic freeze. It was horrific. Hector convulsed, knocking his heavy chair backward. He slammed onto the stone floor, his body seizing uncontrollably. Thick, white foam immediately bubbled rapidly from the corners of his lips. His vocal cords paralyzed in a localized spasm, forcing a wet, unnatural rasp from his throat as he desperately tried to drag air into his freezing lungs. Within 40 agonizing seconds, the violent thrashing reduced to rigid, painful tremors. Hector's muscles locked so intensely his neck veins looked ready to burst. He lay trapped on his back in the pooling blood of his dead men, physically paralyzed but his eyes wide, bloodshot, and filled with primal terror darted frantically up at Marco. Marco stepped back from the suffocating, helpless man. "There is no truce, Hector," Marco whispered lightly. "You don't negotiate with kings. You just disappear." He turned to the shadowy corner of the cellar. "June," Marco commanded, a dark excitement humming in his voice, bypassing his partner. "Get the Ascals. Bring the zip ties and the heavy canvas bags. It's time to take Hector for a boat ride." June didn't move. He stood still, his suppressed pistol still smoking in his hand. Instead of looking at Marco, June looked directly at Mateo, waiting. The Ascals didn't belong to Marco's money, they belonged to Mateo's blood. Marco's euphoric smile faded slightly. The temperature in the stone cellar dropped. Marco met Mateo's eyes. Mateo stared back, feeling his stomach turn, disgusted by the theatrical butchery. He had killed men for threatening their empire, but this was different. This wasn't cartel business. It was torture for the sake of torture. Marco was rapidly losing himself to pure ego, and that was a liability. But there were two dead men and a paralyzed cartel boss bleeding out on the stone floor of their operational base. The mess had to be cleaned up. Mateo gave June a single, tight nod. Only then did June holster his weapon and move to fetch the body bags. The trek down the ridge was a miserable, exhausting nightmare. The dense, tropical canopy of the forest blocked out the moonlight. The earlier rain had turned the steep, rocky trail into a treacherous slip-and-slide of thick, sucking mud. June and 4 Ascal enforcers struggled to drag 3 heavy canvas bags, one containing the rigid, suffocating Hector, and 2 containing the dead, bleeding dead weight of his bodyguards. Mateo walked behind them in the pitch black, watching the exhausting labor. "Take the slack." June grunted, his boots sliding dangerously in the sludge as Hector's nearly 250-pound frame snagged on a tree root. The canvas tore slightly, revealing Hector's wide, terrified, fully conscious eyes staring out blindly into the darkness. June shoved the heavy bag free, panting heavily. The glamorous, cinematic illusion of Marco's empire evaporated right there in the freezing mud. It was just raw, ugly butchery, carried out by exhausted kids from the slums. When they finally reached the muddy shoreline, the cold air smelled intensely of decaying fish and sulfur. 3 small, unstable, motorized wooden bancas, traditional Filipino outrigger boats were waiting in the reeds. The local fishermen who owned them were nowhere to be found. Marco had paid them enough cash to disappear to the neighboring province for an entire week and forget they had ever owned a boat. The dark waters of Tall Lake lapped gently against the muddy shore. But unlike the clear oceans of the provinces, this water was a opaque black. Centuries of volcanic ash, sulfur deposits, and deep crater minerals had turned the lake into a murky, impenetrable soup. You couldn't see more than 6 inches below the surface, even with a high-powered flashlight. It was the perfect graveyard. June hauled Hector's body out of the torn canvas bag and roughly rolled him onto the wooden floorboards of the lead boat. The impact forced a horrible, wet gurgle out of Hector's frozen throat. He lay there stiff as a board, foam crusting on his lips, staring up at the cloudy night sky in absolute, excruciating panic. Mateo climbed into the unstable boat, nearly capsizing the thin wooden banca under his weight. He sat by the outboard motor, refusing to help with the bindings. June picked up a thick, rusted iron chain. Attached to the end of the chain were 3 heavy, concrete cinder blocks. June went about the grim, exhausting mechanical labor of death, awkwardly wrestling the heavy iron chain under and around Hector's rigid, locked waist, securing it with a steel padlock. The enforcers shoved the dead weight of the 2 bleeding bodyguards into the other boats, chaining them to their own cinder blocks. Marco stepped delicately into the lead boat last, balancing carefully to avoid getting mud or blood on his imported leather shoes. "Take us to the center, Teo," Marco ordered softly, assuming his throne at the bow. "Right near the crater drop-off." Mateo didn't acknowledge the command verbally. He just yanked the cord on the outboard motor. It fought him, coughing out dark smoke, before it finally roared to life, breaking the ancient silence of the lake. They cut through the black water for 20 minutes, the small boat riding dangerously low with the weight of Hector and the concrete. The lights of the mansion glowed like a tiny beacon on the high ridge far behind them. The closer they got to the dark, smoking silhouette of the volcano in the center of the lake, the stronger the smell of sulfur became. It smelled like rotten eggs and burning earth. It smelled like hell itself. Mateo cut the engine. The boat glided to a slow, rocky halt. The silence that followed was suffocating. The water was still. Deep down below them, the crater dropped hundreds of feet into a sunless, ash-choked abyss. "This is it," Mateo said, assessing the dark depth. Marco slowly stood up in the rocking boat, causing it to pitch dangerously sideways. He looked down at Hector. The cartel boss was sweating profusely, tears streaking down his rigid, twitching face as the reality of his impending death fully locked in. "You see, Hector," Marco said, his voice carrying clearly over the black water. "If I shoot you in the street, the police have a crime scene. If I bury you in the jungle, stray dogs will eventually dig up your bones. But Tall Lake?" Marco gestured grandly at the opaque, sulfur-scented water. "This lake is filled with tons of volcanic ash. It chokes the light. It actively destroys the sonar of police dive teams. The ash wraps around everything that sinks, pulling it down into the sediment forever. It is the perfect eraser." Marco stepped forward and placed his custom leather shoe squarely onto Hector's chest. Mateo watched the exchange, his jaw tight. He felt a deep, unsettling disgust creeping into his chest that had nothing to do with the mountain wind or the smell of sulfur. Marco wasn't just executing a threat to secure their shipping lanes. He was enjoying playing God. He was fully savoring the psychological and physical torture of a helpless, suffocating man. Mateo realized with stark clarity that Marco had officially crossed an invisible line, and there was no coming back. "Enjoy the dark, Toro," Marco whispered. With a sharp thrust of his leg, Marco kicked. Hector's heavy body scraped against the wooden edge of the boat, tipping it so far to the side that freezing black water briefly rushed over the bow. The concrete cinder blocks yanked him over the side. Splash! The black water swallowed him instantly. Because of the neuromuscular blocker, Hector couldn't thrash. He couldn't scream. He couldn't physically fight back. The weight of the cinder blocks dragged his stiff, convulsing body down into the freezing abyss like a stone. He vanished beneath the sulfur-scented surface, fully awake, fully aware as the water forcefully flooded his lungs. Within seconds, the lake was still again. From the other boats, June unceremoniously dumped the dead bodies of the two treacherous bodyguards into the water. 2 more heavy splashes echoed through the night. Then, silence. Marco stood at the edge of the boat, staring down into the impenetrable black water. A wide, euphoric smile stretched across his face. He looked like a man who had just discovered the ultimate secret to the universe. 3 more ghosts added to the volcano, Marco laughed softly, turning to Mateo. We are genuinely invincible, Teo. Mateo sat silently by the outboard motor. He looked from the dark water up to the glittering lights of Marco's mansion on the distant ridge. Marco believed the mansion was a fortress. He believed the lake was a perfect shield. But Mateo had grown up surviving in the gutters. He knew the fundamental truth of the world wasn't luxury or cleverness. It was physics. Whatever goes up must eventually crash down. And the heavier the crown, the harder the fall. Mateo pulled the starter cord, roaring the engine back to life. He didn't say a word as he steered the boat back toward the muddy shore. His partner was losing his mind to the violence. And soon, Mateo knew, the bodies buried in the ash were going to demand a reckoning. The very next morning, before Marco even woke from his champagne-fueled stupor, Mateo drove back into the city alone. He bypassed their usual security protocols and paid a lucrative, off-the-books visit to Marco's disgraced chemist in the basement of the BGC clubs, demanding a specialized, highly concentrated batch of the neuromuscular blocker be created exclusively for him. Mateo wasn't leaving his survival to chance anymore. He had secretly begun wiring the fail-safes for his partner's inevitable collapse.